What's up guys, it's me Jeremy, and as I'm sure you guys all know, the Hearthstone ladder is something that takes quite a bit of a grind to build up a deck to play on, and if you're a budget player for whatever reason and you either don't want to or realistically probably can't spend money on the game, then creating a deck for Constructed can be a really big problem for you. So I've created a list of 9 really solid budget decks that I think all of these decks are really solid, definitely strong enough to get to rank 5, and at least half of them are strong enough to get to legend. And there's one for each class, so depending on whatever you like to play, you can pick your favorite class and just use that budget deck. And the thing that we discussed when I was creating these budget decks with some of the other Tempo Storm writers was how much dust constitutes a budget deck, and the amount we decided on was 2,000 dust. So 2,000 dust is what we ended up deciding what it takes for a budget deck, and the reason for that is because if you're a free-to-play player, realistically you could grind up 2,000 dust in probably about 2 to 3 weeks, as if you're playing every single day and doing your grind, maybe playing a couple hours a day, you could easily get this deck in about 2 to 3 weeks of just pure grinding. And the thing is to consider is that a pack, you have to remember, a pack on average is worth 104.3 dust, so it would take you about 20 packs to get these decks. And so we feel like that's a pretty reasonable amount and a reasonable grind for a free-to-play player to get a budget deck to get to legend. And I'm going to be going through these decks pretty quickly because I want to keep this video under about 10 minutes or so. So just screenshot the deck and you can analyze it later. I'll talk a tiny bit about each one, but let's jump right into it. Starting off with the Hunter deck. This is a Face Hunter deck of 1860 dust. It's a pretty standard Face Hunter. The only main difference is that we use Gilbin Stalker instead of Haunted Creeper because we're a budget player, we're not playing with Naxxramas. And other than that, it's really just standard Face Hunter. This deck is definitely good enough to get to legend. I think it's really strong. People are playing a very similar version. They're pretty much playing this exact deck, but with Haunted Creeper, even if they're not a budget player. So it's a pretty strong deck. So if you're into Hunter, you can definitely check that one out. And the next deck we have is Face Warrior. So this is a face deck, a very aggressive face deck with Warrior. It requires a lot of, face damage with weapons and chargers and some higher value creatures like Frothing Berserker, as well as some strong finishers in Arcanite Reaper and Argent Commander. So this is a 2100 dust aggressive Warrior deck. I'm not too sure how good this deck is, but you could definitely get to rank 5 with it. Not too sure about legend, but I think climbing up the ladder with this kind of deck is definitely possible. And if you're a really skilled player, get a little bit lucky, you could probably get to legend as well. The next deck is a Shaman deck. This is a sort of mid-range-ish mech Shaman deck with a Bloodlust as a finisher. I think Bloodlust is a great budget card, and so we're going to be using that card in this deck, as well as you can see just kind of a mech engine with Whirling Zap-O-Matic, Harvest Golems, and Power Maces, and of course a couple of rares that are really solid like Manatide Totem, Defender of Argus, Azure Drake, and a lot of really solid basic cards from the Shaman deck coming out, and that's going to cap you out at 2060 dust. I think this deck is actually really strong. You could definitely get to legend with this deck, and it's something that I actually really enjoy playing. I like this deck a lot too. So that's the Shaman deck. The next deck is the Budget Rogue deck. This is actually probably one of my favorite budget decks, and this deck focuses on the insanely powerful card of Iron Sensei. So this is a really strong mech rogue deck that is very off meta, and playing an off meta kind of build gives you a lot of advantages when you're playing on the ladder. People aren't really going to expect cards like Iron Sensei, and so you can get a lot of advantage out of them. And honestly, the cards in itself are pretty strong, and heck, you could even play something like Target Dummy in this deck if you wanted to. I mean, this deck's really cool and I really enjoy it, and 1600 dust is pretty freaking cheap, so definitely check it out. And the next deck is a Paladin face deck. This is probably the worst deck out of the 9 budget decks because it's kind of a little bit outdated. I think the Hobgoblin version of Aggressive Paladin is probably better. However, that deck requires around 4,000 dust or so, so it's obviously not a budget option. But this deck uses a lot of really cheap creatures and some Knife Jugglers to create value around them and then make a huge Divine Favor play. If you end up using Divine Favor for like 4+ cards, you can actually end up getting some insane value and really just tempo out the game like crazy. And you can stall with cards like Noble Sacrifice to prevent your opponent from getting value, and then eventually just rush them down and go for the win. So 1440 dust, I believe that is, yes, that is the cheapest budget deck here. So you could definitely check that one out too. The next one we have is a Warlock deck. This is kind of your typical zoo. This is the first deck that uses a Naxxramas wing. And so the thing to consider is that one Naxxramas wing is worth 700 gold, which can be translated roughly into 700 dust, since a pack, 100 gold, is worth, on average, 104.3 dust. Now that's with a sample size of about 30,000 packs or so I think it's reasonably accurate to say that the 100 gold to 104.3 dust ratio is pretty accurate. And so I used the Naxxramas wing, I calculated that as if it was 700 dust. And so the Haunted Creeper is insanely important in this deck. It's probably one of the most important cards in the deck, and you could maybe play it without it, in which case the deck would cap out at 1360 dust, give or take a few depending on what cards you replaced it with. But overall, it's a very standard zoo deck. You could definitely get to Legend with this kind of thing. It's pretty typical, not really anything out of the ordinary here. I'm sure you've all seen your cut and dry, cut pen and paper zoo deck. So that's kind of just what that is. And next up we have my personal favorite of these 9 budget decks, and obviously the most expensive budget deck at 3020 dust. This is Flood Mage. Now, it's a very tempo-oriented deck that uses 2 wings of Naxxramas. So if you already have Naxxramas, this deck is actually only 1620 dust for you. So if you have Naxxramas, I definitely recommend this one. It's my personal favorite budget deck. I actually use this deck to ladder a lot now. I'm using this deck over, decks with legendaries and stuff. This deck is so much fun. It's a lot of really cool plays. You go Echo Medivh, your duplicates, you got so many 2-for-1s with Arcane Intellect, but at the same time you play a really aggressive tempo-oriented game that's really fun to experience, and it's a deck that I really enjoy. And Counterspell as well is just so cool. Just playing cards like these that you don't really get to experience in a lot of decks is just so much fun, and I really like this deck. So even though it's 3020 dust, which is realistically a lot more than 2000 dust, and it would probably take you about a month to grind up this deck, I wanted to include this because I think it is, at least in my preference, the most fun budget deck, and it's really strong, and you could definitely get to Legend with a deck like this. This is actually probably the strongest budget deck as well, I would say, in my opinion at least. And the next deck we have is Druid. It's a little bit expensive at 2520 dust because the Druid decks require you to play a reasonable amount of epics like Ancient of Lore, which is just such a good card. You just can't pass it up. And so this is a mech Druid deck. It's a deck focused on early board control that you snowball into a combo play with Force of Nature and Savage Roar, as well as having some really strong finishers with like Druid of the Claw. Piloted Sky Golem's really good. If you had a little bit more money, maybe you could use Dr. Boom instead of Piloted Sky Golem, and some tech cards instead of Clockwork Gnome. Like, I know a lot of people would like to play BGH, but since we're playing on a budget here, I think this is the way to go. Probably the best form to build this kind of mech Druid deck in, that you can use cards like Mech Warper, give you so much tempo, so much early board presence overall, and just such really strong cards. Ancient of Lore is amazing. Druid of the Claw is fantastic. Piloted Shredder, all these cards are such high value, and you can create so many plays with these kinds of cards. And overall, I think this deck is definitely good enough to get Legend. And the last deck we have is a kind of a standard Priest control. This is a Priest deck focused on beating aggro decks, because I think the Priest decks focused on beating control decks tend to play a lot more legendaries and epics as well. So instead of that, we just compensate by playing 2 mind control, so you don't have to play any legendaries. And you are going to need the Cabal Shadow Priest, which is why it's a little bit over 2000 dust, 2440. But this is actually a control deck that you can play on a budget. So I think that's really cool, because most of the budget decks tend to be extremely aggressive, really fast-paced aggro decks. And if you don't like that kind of style, it can be really painful to play on a budget in Hearthstone. So if you're a control player, if you really like playing the slow-paced game, control-oriented kind of deck, you can play this Priest deck, and you're going to have a lot of fun with it too, because this deck totally poops on all aggressive decks. So you're just going to shut them down completely with your so much AoE board clears with Wild Pyromancer. Silence is fantastic. Zombie Chows give you a lot of early board presence. And then you can still have a chance of beating control decks quite effectively too, with cards like Thought Steal and Mind Control too. So it's a pretty solid control deck. I personally like Priest a lot, but it tends to be, at least I think in the general sense, tends to be one of the weaker classes on ladder right now. But in a Priest meta where Priest is a strong deck, I think you could definitely get to Legend with this kind of build, as well as in an aggro heavy meta. So if you're playing against a lot of aggressive decks, you could definitely climb up to Legend with this kind of deck. So overall, those were my 9 budget decks. I do have a couple more, but I think those were the best budget option for each class that I presented. Hopefully you guys can find a budget option that is fun for you, because I think that's the most important thing. You want to choose the deck based on what's fun and what you think you're going to enjoy, because if you don't enjoy the deck and you want to get to Legend, like, it's really not going to happen, because you have to play so many games to climb up to Legend that if you're not actually having fun with the deck you're playing, it can be really tough to play out those 200-300 games that you need to win in order to get to Legend. And so hopefully you found a budget option that you liked and can pick a class that you enjoy playing to build a budget deck around. So good luck grinding your budget decks. My name is Jeremy. These were my competitive budget decks for this current Hearthstone season. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey guys, it's me, Jeremy. Thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, definitely make sure to hit that like button so I can tell, and if you're interested, definitely check me out on all the socials, of which you can see over there. And if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe for some more awesome content in the future, as well as you can check out some of my other videos up here and over there. Anyways, that's going to be it. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, I'll see you guys next time.